Welcome back to Pace Immigration, paceimmigration.com, talking once again with immigration lawyer Michael O'Rourke. Michael, good to see you.
Hi, Sean. How's it going?
Great, thanks. We're getting down to some basics here, some nuts and bolts. And I have to admit that even today, after all the talking to you I do about immigration, I still get a little bit confused by these terms. So we have here visa, status, and authorized stay. What's the difference? We'll break down the definitions of these terms in U.S. immigration parlance. We'll start with what is a visa? The stuff I have here on the screen, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, I took from the government website. But Michael, if you'd like to paraphrase, what is a visa?
Sure. A visa is permission to come into the United States. There are only two nationalities that don't require visas to enter the U.S., and those are Canadians and Bermudians. Everybody else has to have a visa or some sort of waiver for a visa. For instance, you have mentioned in the slide visa-free travel. That only applies to those two nationalities. There are about another 25 or so nationalities that can take part of the visa waiver program, and that doesn't require a person of that nationality to obtain a physical visa in their U.S. passport, but they still have to get an ESTA, which is an electronic travel authorization to be able to enter the U.S. for 90 days.
Right. Let's take a look at the visa itself. If you're finding it difficult to read this on the screen, don't worry. It's equally hard. If you go to the government website with the what they've got written on there, it's also very difficult. But this is what you would find on the government website. This is the visa that would go in your passport. Is that right?
Yes, and it takes up a full page of the passport. There are some things that I would like to point out on here because they're easily confused. So on the diagram, the red number to the bottom right-hand corner of the visa is your actual visa number. A lot of people mistake the upper right-hand corner control number as the visa number, but that I think is just an internal number that the State Department uses to track the visa. Anytime that you're asked for a visa number, though, it's that red number that you need to provide.
Okay.
Another thing that is important to know on this visa example, there's the M for multiple entry. Certain nationalities, such as Iranians, are only given single entry visas. It is very typical to see the M, and most of you will see that whenever you get a U.S. visa, but always check to make sure that you have the ability to use this visa over time and it is not a single entry.
Anything else to know about this? Like, what about the photograph and stuff like that?
The photograph has to have very specific requirements when you upload it in your DS-160, or if you provide it to the consular officer. There are the things about dimensions. You can't wear glasses. You can't wear hats. It's got to be full-on frontal with a white background. One last thing to point out, and it's not on this example, but a lot of visas that are tied to work statuses like an H-1B or an L-1, they will have something on the bottom of the visa called a PED date. And that PED date is the date of the petition validity. So even though your visa is valid, say, for 5 years, the PED date might limit how long you can work in that status on that visa.
Okay.
Because remember, a visa is really just the entree into the U.S. It is, the dates are only there to show when you can enter the U.S. They don't really have any other bearing on your status in the U.S.
Yeah, and that's where it gets a little confusing, right? Because, so for me, status versus the visa. So the visa is basically saying we vetted you. You're allowed to come. That doesn't mean you're allowed to enter, does it? That's ultimately still at the point of entry, is it not?
Exactly. CBP, Customs and Border Protection, are the ones who decide whether you can enter the United States. The visa is a pre-vetting. Usually, if you're granted a visa, you will be allowed to enter the United States, but that is always at the discretion of the CBP officer. Uh,
Right.
Another important thing to know is that you might have a visa, but while you're outside of the United States, you don't have any sort of status. Status is what visa, well, I don't even want to use the word visa class because that's going to confuse it. Status is the class of entry that you are given when you come into the United States. So you've got here immigrant status versus non-immigrant status. Difference is that immigrant is permanent. Your desire to remain in the U.S. is permanent, and that is evidenced by an immigrant visa in your passport, or once that has been activated and you've entered the U.S., then you're given a green card. Non-immigrant status is everything else. It's temporary. You always have to have the intent to return to your home country, and your non-immigrant status could be, say, B1 for a business visitor or an L1 for an intercompany transfer. That's what we mean in terms of status. It is the classification you're given when you're entering the U.S., and that status as a non-immigrant always has an expiration date.
Right. The clock is always ticking, and I guess it's just because they both terms, immigrant status and non-immigrant status, both use the word immigrant in them, that it still confuses me sometimes when I hear it, and I have to remember non-immigrant status doesn't mean it's not like you're not coming into the country or something. It just means you have to have that intention to leave, and the clock is ticking.
Exactly. U.S. law presumes that anybody who shows up at the border is asking to be admitted to the U.S. as an immigrant. So, in typical government speak, to make somebody non-immigrant or not an immigrant, they're going to be a non-immigrant. And you have to actually prove to CBP and to your consular officer when you're doing the visa interview that you have ties to your home country and that you do not want to become an immigrant to the U.S.
Okay. Let's move on to this important one here. And this one, all these reminders, I'm like, that's right. So this is very important because people will get a visa. One that we've already talked about, they'll get a visa and think this is an automatic get into the country thing, but that's not true because you have to be admitted by border protection. And the second thing is a visa and its expiration date have nothing to do with your authorized length of stay. The visa could say whatever date it wants. That doesn't mean you can stay in the United States until that date, does it?
Exactly. The visa is really just a start date and an end date of when you can enter the U.S. But when you meet CBP, they will generate a form called an I-94. They will sometimes write this date in your passport as well, but sometimes not. So the I-94, you can find it online by just typing in CBP I-94 and put in your passport information. But the I-94 is actually what controls your authorized stay in the U.S., and it'll also show your status. Some CBP officers, if they're having a bad day or if you've given them something to be concerned about, might just give you a few days entry. If you say, I'm going to Disneyland for a week, then your I-94 is for a week. So you have to be very careful about it, because if you overstay the date that CBP gives you on your I-94, then you can start racking up penalties. It's called being out of status. And being out of status for, say, over 6 months, then starts to incur all sorts of penalties about re-entry to the United States.
So if your visa says on it, say, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, but they write something else on that form I-94, pay very close attention to that date, right?
Exactly, because really it doesn't matter how long your visa might be valid for. It's your I-94 which controls how long you can stay in the U.S.
Now, you did make mention to me off camera about employment and how that ties together with the I-94. Go into that a little bit.
Exactly. So if you're admitted into a classification which permits employment, say the L1 for intercompany transfers, or H1B for specialized knowledge professionals, or O1 for extraordinary individuals, that admission is for a period of time when you can work in the country. If you have something that gives you some sort of permission to work that is separate from your I-94 date, then you will have something like an employment authorization document. Your authorized work period might not be the same as your authorized stay or your visa or your visa dates. So it's very careful to understand, or you have to be very careful in understanding which of these three things are working at any one moment to permit you to stay and work in the United States. For instance, I'll give you an example just to make it a little bit more clear. Say you are a student and you have an EAD, employment authorization document, based on your educational program. The EAD is the document that controls how long you can work in the United States. You might have an I-94 that is longer or says duration of status. That means it coincides with your educational program. And your visa might be, say, a 10-year visa. But the EAD, being the most restrictive, is what you have to pay attention to. So, yeah, there are a lot of moving parts in U.S. immigration law. It's not one simple answer of how long you can stay, how long you can work, and how long your visa is, like in some other countries.
Right, because all you ever hear people really talk about is visas. My visa's this, my visa's good for that, my visa's good for that. Actually, your visa, you have to be careful with that. Your visa says you're allowed to come, but it doesn't mean you're even allowed in yet, and it has nothing to do with an authorized period of stay at all.
Exactly.
Okay. And that's when people, I think, need to talk. If you're watching this program or listening on the podcast and you're getting into visas and EADs and things like this, it's probably worthwhile to give Michael a call. Michael, I have one last question for you. When it comes to visas, can you renew them while you're in the United States, or is it a case of you have to be out of there and then you have to reapply or something?
So the visa itself, you have to go back to a U.S. consulate outside of the U.S., since there are no consulates inside the U.S., and to renew it at the consulate. You can, however, sometimes extend your status in the U.S. So, for instance, if you have a TN visa and you're permitted to come into the U.S. and work for 3 years, and your employer still wants you to work and you still want to work, then what you would do is file an application with USCIS to extend your TN status. That way you can continue to work. USCIS will issue you an I-94, and that will take the place of the initial I-94 that CBP had given you. So there are ways to extend status. It is not always a case-by-case basis, but you have to make sure that you have the right to extend your status, that it's an extendable status, and that all of the conditions are there for you to be able to extend your status.
I think a lot of people too have this notion, I know I do even today, that I think, oh, well, they've been in the country for years, so that will eventually lead to permanent residency and then citizenship. But that's not the way it works, is it?
No, unfortunately, permanent residence is usually based on a petition either by a family member or by a company. The Biden administration just today entered into a settlement agreement allowing TPS holders, temporary protected status, to apply for permanent residence as well. But in general, permanent residence isn't automatic.
Right, like you can't be in the country on an H-1B for, say, 5 to 7 years, and that somehow gives you credit towards a green card.
No, you need to make the application. It has to be approved, and then you have to, unfortunately, get in a very long waiting line.
Okay. Michael O'Rourke, thanks again. Always good to talk to you. Very informative stuff. You can reach him at mo'rourke@pacelawfirm.com. Michael, we'll catch you next time.
Sounds great. Thanks, Sean. Take care. Bye-bye.